I found the box 3 hours after we buried my mother-in-law. It was a small cedar chest, 15 inches long and maybe 8 deep, tucked behind jars of last season's pickled beets in her root cellar. The brass clasp so tarnished it looked like bark. I almost missed it in the dim light of a single bare bulb, but my hand brushed against its corner when I bent to retrieve a crate of Alan's childhood baseball cards. By the time the police finished fingerprinting that same box 6 months later, my sister-in-law would be standing in an orange jumpsuit, and I would own every seed inside it, every one of them now shipping nationwide under a stamp I designed myself. Sown from fraud. What happened between that dusty cellar and the day she started packing envelopes for me under a federal garnishment order is a lesson in how deeply greed can burrow into family soil, and how sometimes the quietest voice in the room has already mapped every escape route before you even knew you needed one. My name is Carolyn. I spent 22 years as a cardiac step-down nurse at St. Luke's Regional, the kind of unit where you learn to read a patient's rhythm not just from the monitors, but from the color of their lips, the sheen of sweat on their forehead, the way they hold their breath when they think no one is watching. I retired with a lump sum pension of $95,000 after my husband Alan lost his fight with pancreatic cancer, a diagnosis that came on a Tuesday in March and took him by November of that same year. Alan was the kind of man who fixed neighbors' fences without being asked and never once raised his voice at me in 16 years of marriage. His sister, Diane, and I had always been cordial, trading Christmas cards and the occasional lunch, but we became genuinely close after Alan died, bonded by grief and a shared love of gardening that I had picked up from their mother, Alina. So when Diane approached me with a vision to turn Alina's lifetime collection of heirloom seeds into a non-profit library, a living archive of rare vegetable and flower cultivars before the big agricultural conglomerates erased them, it felt like Alan was sending me a new purpose. I handed over every cent of my pension check without blinking, and we co-founded Garden Lineage Seed Trust as equal partners, with a handshake and a shared bank account at First Federal Credit Union. I didn't think twice about the fact that I had left myself no financial cushion. I was a nurse. I believed in the trust you place in people's hands because I had held too many of them as they slipped away. Diane's mother, Alina, was the quiet architect of that entire collection. For 40 years, she had traded seeds with old-timers across 3 counties, meticulously recording germination rates, disease resistance, and flavor profiles in lined composition notebooks that smelled of wood smoke and loam. She lived alone in the farmhouse where Alan and Diane grew up, a white clapboard 2-story with a wraparound porch and a root cellar dug into the side of a gentle slope, and she never trusted banks or digital records. Everything she knew lived in those notebooks, and in the tiny envelopes of seed she stored in a temperature-controlled chest, freezer out in the pole barn. When Alina died suddenly of a stroke at 81, Diane and I were both listed as co-executors of a will that left the seed collection to our trust, with the physical farmhouse held in a life estate for me, the widow of her only son. That detail would become a landmine none of us saw coming. The funeral was modest, a graveside service under a white tent with folding chairs and a cold wind that kept pulling at the floral arrangements. Diane wept loudly through the eulogy, clutching a handkerchief, while Mitch, her husband, stood beside her with his jaw tight and his eyes scanning the crowd as if he were counting heads. Mitch had the smile of a timeshare salesman and a leased Lexus he washed twice a week, and I had never quite trusted the way he said, "Family is everything," with the same tone he used when discussing quarterly earnings reports. At the reception in the church basement, I overheard him on a phone call near the coat rack, speaking in a low, rapid-fire tone about closing the portfolio before the quarter ends, and don't let the due diligence flag the provenance issue. I didn't know what provenance meant yet, but the word lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. The next morning, I drove to the farmhouse alone. The will reading had been a formality. There was nothing to distribute except the house, the seeds, and a few $100s in a checking account. I wanted to begin sorting Alina's papers, to feel close to Alan and to her by handling the things she had touched. When I pulled into the gravel drive, Diane's silver SUV was already there. I let myself in the side door and found Diane in the living room, flipping through a binder of what looked like legal documents. Mitch was on his phone in the kitchen, pacing in front of the stove. Diane looked up with a start, then smoothed her expression into a smile. "Carolyn, sweetie, you should be resting. Grief is exhausting. Mitch and I are going to take care of everything. Mom wanted us to consolidate the estate quickly to avoid probate complications." I noted the word probate and how she hurried past it. "I just wanted to retrieve some of Alan's childhood photos from the cellar," I said, keeping my voice soft. "I won't get in your way." Her smile flickered. "Oh, the cellar is a mess. You'll probably just find mouse droppings and old canning jars. Don't bother yourself." I nodded and headed down the wooden stairs anyway, and that's when I saw the cedar chest. It was pushed almost out of sight behind a row of quart jars filled with beets the color of dark rubies, a burlap sack half draped over it. I knelt and pulled it free. The wood was cool and smooth, the clasp rusted shut but still intact. I had just lifted it onto my lap when I heard Diane's footsteps on the stairs. "Find anything?" She appeared behind me, wiping her hands on her slacks. I held up the chest. "Just this old box." She laughed, a short, brittle sound. "Oh, that old thing. Mom used to keep her favorite seed samples in there, but the clasp is broken and half the seeds are probably dead. Just junk. Toss it in the burn pile with the rest of the garden trash." She watched me set it on the step, then walked back up without waiting for a reply. I didn't believe her. Eleanor had been meticulous, borderline obsessive, about cataloging and preserving. She would never store dead seeds in a cedar chest, which naturally repels insects and regulates humidity. And the clasp was not broken. I had felt the resistance of a working lock when I lifted the lid slightly. I waited until I heard Mitch's car door slam in the driveway, the Lexus engine ticking over gravel, and then I opened my jacket and slid the chest inside, pressing it against my ribs like a stolen heart. I didn't look at it again until I was home that night, alone in my kitchen with a cup of chamomile and the kind of silence that lets you hear your own pulse. My kitchen table was an old oak farmhouse piece that Eleanor had given us as a wedding gift. I set the chest in the center and examined the clasp under the pendant light. It was a simple warded lock, the kind you used to see on old diary boxes, with a keyhole shaped like a tiny shield. My grandfather on my mother's side had been a locksmith in Omaha for 42 years, and when I was 10, he taught me how to pick a ward lock with a bent paperclip and a steady hand. He would sit me at his workbench and hand me a practice lock, saying, "Feel the spring tension, girl. Don't force it. Listen." I hadn't used the skill in decades, but my fingers still remembered. I straightened a large paperclip, bent a small hook at the tip, and inserted it gently. 2 seconds of probing, a soft click, and the clasp sprang open. Inside, the chest was lined with cedar shavings that still smelled faintly of the woods. Nestled in compartments were dozens of tiny glassine envelopes, each no larger than a matchbook, labeled in Eleanor's spidery cursive. Cherokee Purple Tomato, 1987. Moon and Stars Watermelon, 1992. Baker Creek Blue Corn, 1978. Bloody Butcher Corn, 1985. There were maybe 60 packets total, and from the feel of them, many still held seeds. But at the bottom, beneath the last layer of envelopes, was a small leather-bound journal, the size of a passport, with no title. I opened it gently. The pages were filled with notes about seed viability and planting dates, but the last entry was different. It was dated 6 weeks before her death, and in a shakier hand, Eleanor had written, "Do not trust them, save yourself, the seeds know the truth." I read that line 3 times. The word "them" sat heavy in my chest. I already suspected she meant Diane and Mitch. Why else would they want me to burn the box? Why rush the estate? The warning was not dramatic, just flat and certain, the way a nurse documents a terminal diagnosis. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that no amount of deception can bury a truth that someone has already planted in writing. Now let's get into the mechanics of what happened next. The manipulation started within 48 hours. Diane called me the next morning, her voice syrupy with concern. "Sweetie, I know you're grieving, but we really need to get the estate paperwork moving. Mitch has a friend who's an estate attorney, and he's drawn up some simplified documents so we can dissolve the trust and just split everything privately. Much easier than dealing with the state. Can you come over for dinner tonight?" I agreed, and I spent the afternoon photocopying every page of Eleanor's journal and hiding the originals in a hollowed-out book on my shelf, a trick from my days of documenting medical errors that never made it into charts. That evening, I drove to their house, a sprawling McMansion with a 3-car garage and a kitchen island the size of a morgue slab. The granite countertops were polished to a mirror shine, and the stainless steel appliances still had the energy efficiency stickers on them. Over deli trays and a bottle of wine they didn't offer me, Mitch spread a set of documents across the island. I recognized the format immediately. A partnership dissolution agreement, with a section titled Assignment of Intellectual Property, and a line declaring that my initial contribution of $95,000 was a charitable gift to the trust rather than an equity investment. My name was already typed in the signature block. Beside it was a draft sale agreement with a company called Verdant Agro Solutions LLC, though the purchase price was left blank. The nonprofit model is a paperwork nightmare, Carolyn, Mitch said, smoothing his tie. We can run it as a private collection, find a buyer for the physical seed stock, and you'll get a generous monthly stipend for life. No nursing home ever. You've been through enough. Diane slid a pen toward me. Just sign, honey. We can finalize everything tonight, and you won't have to worry about a thing. I felt my heart hammer against my ribs, but I forced myself to blink slowly, tilt my head, and let my voice go soft and foggy. Oh, I'm just so disoriented from the funeral. My doctor put me on a new sleep medication, and I can barely focus my eyes. Can I take it home and look it over when I'm feeling more myself? I promise I'll get it back to you by Friday. Diane's smile tightened so fast I saw the muscles around her mouth jump. Mitch cut in. Of course. But we really need it by Thursday now, actually. The buyer, it's a research lab that wants to sequence the older cultivars. They have a deadline, time sensitive. He stressed the last word as if I were a child. I took the folder, tucked it into my purse, and left soon after. That night I pulled up my bank records and found the cashier's check image for the $95,000. The memo line, in Diane's handwriting, read, Garden Lineage Investment, Equal Partnership, not a charitable gift. I saved that screenshot alongside the text messages I had archived from a year earlier, where Diane had written, Don't worry about the money. Your $95K makes us equal partners, legally and morally. I'd never screw over family. The evidence was already piling up, but I needed them to incriminate themselves further, and I needed to understand the full scope of their scheme. 3 days later, Diane called again with more urgency. Carolyn, sweetie, we're just so worried about you all alone in that house. Why don't you come stay with us for a few weeks while you mourn? We have the guest suite, and you won't have to cook or clean. We'll take care of everything. I knew it was a control tactic, a way to monitor me and isolate me from my own records, but I also knew that inside their house I would have direct access to the source of the fraud. So I agreed, packing a small bag with my toiletries, a few changes of clothes, and the lockpicking tools I had assembled. A tension wrench, a small flathead screwdriver, and a couple of paper clips. I left my laptop at home deliberately so they'd think I was helpless and unconnected. The move-in was jarring. Diane had prepared the guest suite on the second floor, a room with beige walls and a window that overlooked the backyard pool. Mitch's home office was right next door, separated by a thin wall. Within the first day, I noticed the small red flags that most people miss. The FedEx packages that arrived on Tuesday afternoons were immediately whisked into the office and shredded, the glossy confetti spilling into a trash bag Mitch kept beside his desk. Mitch took phone calls at odd hours, midnight sometimes, pacing in the backyard with a cigar and gesturing angrily. Diane's eyes flicked to the office door every time I walked past it. I played the part of the grieving, disoriented widow perfectly, forgetting where I put my teacup, staring out the window for long stretches, napping at odd hours. Meanwhile, I cataloged everything, the rhythm of their days, the location of the shredder, the type of lock on the office door. I had been a nurse for long enough to know that observation is 90% of diagnosis. By the end of the first week, I had reconstructed enough of their schedule to know that every weekday between 2 and 3 in the afternoon, Mitch took a conference call in the backyard with his cigar, and Diane either went to a hair appointment or a yoga class. That gap was my target window, but I needed a reason to be alone near the office without suspicion. The accident that gave me that reason happened on a Thursday. I had borrowed a heavy cast-iron skillet from their kitchen under the pretense of wanting to make cornbread, but I deliberately carried it toward the hallway while pretending to hang a small picture frame I had brought from home. I tripped on the edge of the rug, genuinely stumbled, and let the skillet fly forward. It crashed into the wall just outside the office door, putting a fist-sized dent in the drywall and knocking loose a decorative wall sconce. Mitch came running from the living room, saw me on the floor, flustered and apologizing profusely, and laughed it off with a wave of his hand. "Don't worry, accidents happen, I'll call a handyman." I shook my head, letting my voice tremble. "No, please let me fix it. I did all the drywall repair at the farmhouse. I have spackle in my car, it's the least I can do." He looked at me as if I were a mildly interesting insect, then shrugged and returned to his call. I went to the garage, found a spackle kit, and while I was there, I retrieved my lockpicking tools from my toiletry bag and slipped them into my sweater pocket. The office door had a standard quickset deadbolt, a 5-pin tumbler lock. I had watched Mitch use a key from a hook in the kitchen several times, so I knew the general keyway shape. At 3 o'clock exactly, I heard the sliding glass door open as Mitch stepped onto the patio with his cigar, his voice already rising into a heated discussion about delivery terms on the purchase order. I was inside the office in under 2 minutes. The lock yielded with a soft, satisfying click, the tension wrench holding the plug until I turned it fully. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head. "Good, now don't get caught." The office smelled of toner and stale coffee. The shredding pile was in a plastic bin beside the desk, and on top, still mostly intact because the shredder had jammed, was a document titled Dissolution of Garden Lineage Seed Trust, with a notary stamp dated 3 weeks after Aliner's death and what was supposed to be my signature at the bottom. I held it up to the afternoon light slanting through the blinds. The pen pressure was wrong. The C in Carolyn started with a clockwise loop instead of my counterclockwise habit, a detail no forger ever gets right because they learn from typefaces, not from the muscle memory of actual handwriting. I took a photo with my phone, then quickly photographed the rest of the pile before I carefully replaced it as I had found it. Next, I opened the filing cabinet. It wasn't locked, which told me Mitch was either arrogant or careless, probably both. Inside, meticulously organized in hanging folders, were bank statements from First Federal Credit Union showing the $95,000 deposit, but with a revised memo line that now read, "Charitable contribution, Carolyn H." I recognized the handwriting as Diane's attempt to copy the bank teller's notation style, but the ink color and pressure were subtly different. There was also a draft purchase agreement between Garden Lineage Seed Trust, Diane T., operating manager, and Verdant Agro Solutions, LLC, for the sum of $480,000, contingent on clear chain of title and unencumbered IP assignment by the sole director of record. And in a separate folder labeled Aliner's Will Annex, I found a forged codicil attempting to remove me as co-executor, attached to a fabricated letter from a supposed doctor named R. Hartwell that claimed Aliner was incompetent when she signed the original will. The letterhead was a poorly photocopied logo from a clinic that I knew had closed 5 years earlier because I had referred patients there before Alan died. I photographed everything with my phone, then relocked the office door and spent the next hour patching the drywall as I had promised, my hands shaking slightly but my mind racing. That night, after Mitch and Diane went to bed, I sneaked back down to the kitchen trash and retrieved the bag from the shredder bin. Using a technique I had learned from a forensic nurse who consulted on malpractice cases, I spread the shreds on my guest bed under a bright desk lamp and began piecing them back together, matching paper grain, tear patterns, toner color, and even the alignment of staple holes. It took me 4 nights of working in 30-minute increments when the house was silent, but I eventually reconstructed several critical emails between Mitch and a Verdant Agro Acquisitions manager named Craig Sorensen. One email from Sorensen read, "As long as you can deliver unencumbered IP rights before the end of Q2, we'll wire the full amount. Make sure the widow doesn't contest." Another from Mitch said, "Carolyn is fragile. She won't push back. We'll frame her contribution as a donation, and she won't even know she's been cut out." The ally arrived unexpectedly on a Tuesday morning, and her name was Regina Okonkwo. She was a compliance officer at First Federal Credit Union, a woman with a calm, measured voice and a meticulous attention to detail. She called my cell phone while I was sitting in the guest room, staring at the cedar chest and the reconstructed emails spread across the bedspread like a quilt of betrayal. "Mrs. Hartley, this is Regina from the credit union. I'm calling because we've flagged a pending wire transfer authorization from the Garden Lineage Seed Trust account. It's for $480,000, and the authorization was signed only by Diane T., Montgomery." Our records show the trust's founding documents require dual signatures from both listed directors for any transaction over $10,000. Are you aware of this transfer? My throat tightened. No, I am not, and I have not signed anything. I paused, then added, I believe there may be fraud involved. I have evidence. Regina's tone shifted from professional to alert. Can you come to the branch today? I need to freeze the account, but I'll need to see the founding documents and any evidence you have. And I think we need to loop in law enforcement. That afternoon, I drove to the credit union during what Diane thought was a nap window. I brought the photocopies of the forged dissolution agreement, the emails, the text messages, and a copy of a leaner's journal entry. Regina spread them across a conference table, her eyebrows climbing higher with every page. She then pulled up the bank's archived records and found an additional document I had never seen. A declaration of provenance that a leaner had filed 2 years before her death at a local USDA agricultural extension workshop. A leaner had physically walked into the county recorder's office and recorded a sworn statement that she was the creator of the seed collection, that it was being held in trust for her daughter-in-law Carolyn Hartley, and that any transfer of the germplasm required my notarized consent. It was a dead man's switch, a legal countermeasure that meant Diane and Mitch could never sell those seeds without me, no matter what forgeries they produced. Alina had filed it on paper, offline, specifically because she knew Diane relied on digital shortcuts. She had known. She had planned. Regina connected me to a special agent in the Financial Crimes Division of the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Office of Inspector General, a man named David Wen. I met him at a neutral diner the following day, a place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been brewed in 1973. Agent Wen was quiet and precise, a former forensic accountant who specialized in intellectual property theft cases involving plant variety protection. He confirmed that the seeds Alina had collected included several cultivars that were protected by the Plant Variety Protection Act because they had been deposited in a recognized germplasm bank, and that Verdant Agro's attempt to privatize that genetic material through Diane was a federal offense. He also told me that the National Seed Storage Repository in Fort Collins held a copy of Alina's provenance filing, which named me, and only me, as the legal custodian of record. I was holding all the cards, but Agent Wen needed them to fully incriminate themselves on tape, to make the case airtight, and to ensure Verdant Agro's involvement was documented. I agreed to help set up a controlled operation. I would wear a wire and continue to act compliant, pretending I was ready to sign the dissolution and authorize the transfer. But I needed to gather one final piece of evidence, a recording of Diane and Mitch explicitly acknowledging the forgery and their intent to defraud me. Agent Wen's team installed a tiny microphone in the lining of my blazer, a device that looked like a button but could transmit to a receiver in an unmarked van. I was trained on how to activate it with a simple press of my finger against my hip. The maximum cruelty beat was the moment I chose to test whatever shred of humanity might remain in my sister-in-law. I planned it for a Monday, the day before the supposed bank meeting. I had been a cardiac nurse for over 2 decades, and I knew exactly how to simulate the symptoms of an inferior wall myocardial infarction. The pale skin, the sudden clutching of the chest, the strangled gasp. I waited until Diane and Mitch were in the kitchen, arguing over the final wire details. Mitch was on speakerphone with the Verdant Agro contact, his voice tense, saying, "We need the transfer to hit by noon tomorrow, no more delays." Diane was tapping her nails on the granite countertop, and I could feel the electricity in the air. I walked into the kitchen, paused, then grabbed my chest, let my face go gray, and slumped hard onto the tile floor with a choked cry. My pulse raced from adrenaline, but I lay still, eyes half closed, breathing in shallow, irregular pulls. A real inferior MI often presents with nausea and a feeling of impending doom, and I had coached myself into that state so thoroughly that I almost believed it. I heard Diane's footsteps approach. Her shadow fell across my face, and I waited for her to kneel, to check for a pulse, to call 911, the things any human would do. She stopped. There was a pause of maybe 2 seconds, and then she stepped over my leg, her heel brushing my shin, and walked to the counter. "Finally," she said, her voice flat, directed at Mitch. "Now we can finish this without her hovering. Call the bank. Tell them to expect the wire first thing." Mitch snorted. He kicked my foot aside with the toe of his loafer. Is she dying? Whatever, we're already late. Their footsteps retreated into the living room, and I heard the sliding door open as Mitch went outside to finish his call. I lay there for 3 more minutes, my eyes burning, my chest hollow, until the sound of their voices faded. Then I stood up, brushed off my sweater, and walked to my room. I locked the door and called Agent Wen's burner number. My voice was steady. They stepped over me. I'm ready. That was the moment my family died for good, replaced by 2 strangers I intended to bury under evidence. The confrontation happened the next morning at the First Federal Credit Union on Oak Street. I wore the wired blazer, and beneath it, a second recording device in my skirt pocket as backup, a small digital recorder I had purchased with cash weeks earlier. The marshals were positioned in a maintenance truck across the street, and Agent Wen was in a sedan with tinted windows, listening through an earpiece. Diane and Mitch drove me to the bank, and in the car, Diane kept patting my hand and saying, "This is going to be such a relief, Carolyn. Finally, you can rest." I stared out the window and said nothing. Regina met us at the conference room with a polite, professional smile. She had laid out the transfer authorization form on the polished wood table, along with the partnership dissolution agreement. Diane pushed a pen toward my hand. "Just sign, Carolyn, you promised. We can't hold the buyer any longer," she said, her tone clipped but still coated in that syrupy sweetness. I looked at the pen, then at her. I had rehearsed the words 100 times, standing in front of the mirror in the guest bathroom. I said, "I spent 22 years reviving hearts that stopped because someone ignored a quiet warning. I'm not going to ignore Aliner's voice. I am not signing." The seeds stay where the truth was planted. Mitch's face contorted. He lunged for the folder, but the conference room door opened and Agent Wen stepped in, his badge held out, 4 federal marshals behind him in bulletproof vests. Diane's face went through a color wheel I can still see in my nightmares, from practiced warmth to confusion to a white-hot rage that twisted her features. She screamed something about entrapment, about she's lying, she's delusional, but Wen read her rights in a calm monotone while the marshals handcuffed both of them. The forged documents, the text messages, the reconstructed emails, and the forensic handwriting analysis that a federal expert had already verified were all presented on the table like an autopsy report. Mitch tried to claim he was just an advisor, that Diane had handled everything, but the emails with Verdant Agro showed his digital signature and his voice on the recorded calls discussing the scheme. Both were arrested on 4 counts, each of forgery in the 1st degree, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, attempted grand theft, and violation of the Plant Variety Protection Act. The aftermath unfolded in a cascade I never could have predicted. Diane and Mitch's assets were frozen within 24 hours. Their McMansion, it turned out, was leveraged to the rafters with a predatory mortgage, 2 home equity lines of credit, and a balloon payment due in 3 months. The leased Lexus was already in repossession status because they had stopped making payments, assuming the seed sale would cover everything. Their bank accounts showed a pattern of extravagant spending, luxury vacations, designer clothes, a boat slip rental for a boat they didn't even own. They had been living on debt and stolen dreams. At trial, the text message I had saved, the one where Diane acknowledged my equal partnership, became the pivot point that convinced the jury. The forensic handwriting analyst testified about the forged signature detail, the counterclockwise loop I made that no forger could replicate. The fabricated doctor's letter was torn apart by a real physician who testified that the clinic's license had expired before Aliner's supposed evaluation. Diane's defense attorney tried to paint me as a bitter, grieving widow, but the wire recording of her stepping over my body while she said, "Finally, now we can finish this," destroyed any remaining sympathy. The judge, a woman named Honorable Patricia Duval, handed down a combined sentence of 7 years in federal prison, with mandatory restitution of $480,000 to the trust, which by then had been legally reorganized under my sole ownership. Because the Plant Variety Protection Act carries civil damages up to treble the market value of protected germplasm, Verdant Agro settled out of court for an additional $200,000 after their internal investigation revealed that their acquisitions manager, Craig Sorensen, had knowingly colluded with Diane to bypass the provenance filing. That money, plus the returned pension funds from the dissolved partnership, allowed me to launch Germinated Lies Seed Co. as a fully licensed and bonded seed distribution business. I purchased the farmhouse from Aliner's estate outright, secured it with a new deed, and installed a climate-controlled packaging facility in the pole barn. I hired a team of 3 young horticulturists, none of whom had any connection to anyone named Diane, and we began propagating the heirloom seeds that had sat in that cedar chest, testing their germination rates, and building a catalog that I published on a simple website with a photo of Aliner holding a handful of moon and stars watermelon seeds, taken in 1991. The most satisfying detail, however, was the garnishment order. As part of her restitution, the court required Diane to work 200 hours of community service upon her eventual release, but the civil judgment also placed a permanent wage garnishment against her future earnings until the full restitution was paid. I petitioned the court to allow her to serve that garnishment directly through supervised employment at my company, since she had the botanical knowledge and no one else in the county would hire a convicted fraudster. The judge approved it with a wry smile that told me she understood the poetry. So now, every Wednesday and Friday, Diane reports to the barn at 7 a.m., wearing a uniform smock with no pockets, and she sits at a long wooden packing station in front of a compliance monitor named Grace, a retired probation officer with a no-nonsense stare. Diane fills envelopes with rare seed packets, 5 black crim tomato seeds, 10 glass gem corn kernels, a pinch of bloody butcher corn. She works in silence, her head bowed, while classical music plays softly from a radio I installed just beyond her reach. Every envelope, from the sleek black packets to the hand-labeled manila envelopes for bulk orders, is sealed with a custom rubber stamp I designed myself, a small circle containing a broken scale and the words, "Sown from fraud." I mail those seeds to customers in 47 states now, and each package includes a small card that tells Aliner's story without naming names, just the words. These seeds were saved by a woman who believed in the future and protected by her daughter-in-law from those who tried to steal it. Sometimes I walk past Diane's station, and she won't meet my eyes. The only sounds are the rustle of seed packets, the rhythmic thump of the stamp, and the low hum of the dehumidifier. I think about Aliner's handwriting in that leather journal, the sentence that came right after the warning, which I found on the next page after a closer reading. The seeds know the truth, because they carry the memory of the hand that saved them. She had saved them, and she had saved me, by preparing a legal fortress I didn't even know existed. I keep that journal in the cedar chest now, in my office above the barn, next to a photo of Alan on our wedding day, and a dried Cherokee purple tomato blossom that Aliner pressed between wax paper in 1991. The quiet architect, it turns out, wasn't Alan. It was Aliner all along, planting a future I would reap after she was gone. The moral I hold onto is simple. You don't need to outshout a liar if you've already documented the truth in ink that can't be erased. Greed moves fast, but thoroughness moves faster. If someone in your family asks you to sign something, just to keep things simple, remember that simplicity is often a scalpel hidden under a bandage. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? Tell me your story in the comments. If this video reminded you that quiet vigilance can defeat even the slickest betrayal, please like and subscribe so we can keep shining light into corners where fraud likes to hide. Until next time, keep your hands in the soil and your eyes on the fine print.